So here's the video on just a few Unit 2 cleanup items, things that we didn't have a chance to quite cover in class, and then just one reinforcement from our last class on marginal utility. I think I can get this done in under 10 minutes. So first, from our prior class, we were talking about the trade-off of consumption of two goods. We have good X and good Y, and we're going to basically spend all our money on these two goods, and we're trying to find the optimal combination between X and Y that makes us happiest or gives us the highest utility. And we know that that occurs if we had a little utility graph. We know that that occurs here when the utility is highest. And the assertion is, and we showed this in class, was that when that happens, you're at a point where each dollar you spend on X and the last dollar you spent on Y essentially gives you equal utility. So the utility per dollar spent is equal. So the question is, why does that mean you're at an optimum? Well, first of all, this is going to be kind of a variant on MBC equals MB, marginal benefits equals marginal cost, when you're optimizing. And we're essentially, because we're trading off good Y for good X. And so why is it at an optimum? Well, let's think about the other two cases that can happen. If I'm spending all my money and I'm in a spot where the last dollar I spent on X gave me more utility than the dollar I spent on Y, well, that means I'm in a zone where X is making me happier per dollar. And so what I should do then is buy more X. But in order to buy more X, I have to give up some Y, so I'm just going to buy less of good Y. And by doing that, if I'm in a spot right here, even though I'm spending the same amount of money, I can make myself happier. And then let's look what happens in the opposite case here. If I'm spending all my money and at the point I'm at, the last dollar I spent on X is making me less happy than the last dollar I spent on Y, well, I get more happiness out of Y. This tells me I should buy more of Y. And because I'm spending all my money, the only way I can do that is to buy less X, and that'll make me happier. So when you combine both of these things, if one's less than the other and one's greater than the other, you get to that, and then as long as you're bouncing back between these two, this is what's going to result when you're maximizing your utility. So that's just a little bit more motivation behind why this is the case at maximum utility. The second cleanup item was providing a little more insight into the law of demand. As we recall, the law of demand says that as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And we always see that when these demand curves going down, sloping downward, or as you slope up left, over to the left and up. And that's the law of demand. But the question here is, why does that happen? So we know that it does happen for just a vast majority of goods. Let's talk about why. And there's really just a few key reasons. And one we learned in our last class, and it's this idea of diminishing marginal utility, which is, let's recall what that is. For every quantity, extra quantity, 1 unit of quantity of a good that I consume, I get less and less utility at some point for that good. Well, that could be easily demonstrated on this graph, and that's reflected in the fact that I'm willing to pay less and less for that good. That's the price of the good that I'm willing to pay is a measure of its utility to me. The more utility a good has for me, the more I'm willing to pay. And here, as my quantity moves this way, I'm getting more and more sick of whatever I'm buying. I'm willing to pay less and less and less and less for each one of those goods, and so therefore the demand curve has to slope down. So that's one key theory about why the demand curve slopes down, and you can just give that kind of as its own idea right here. Early in the chapter, there was also another explanation given for why demand curves slope down, and it was these two ideas called the substitution effect and income effect. And I wanted to just briefly cover that so you understand those two items, because they may come up on the AP exam as well. So the substitution effect is actually a relatively straightforward idea. That just says when prices go up for my good, consumers are going to buy other stuff, which is, as we know, that's substitute. You replace a good that you're currently buying with something similar. And because you're substituting, demand goes down. So that's really all the substitution effect is price increases, I buy less of that good because I'm going to move my consumption to other cheaper goods. So that's often given as the primary reason for a downsloping demand curve. And then there's this other idea called the income effect, which is a little bit more subtle and can go in either direction. So let me just briefly describe what that is. So the idea here is that when prices go up for a good, essentially I feel less wealthy, which is like a drop of income, because now I have to spend, let's just say I'm spending my money as I would like, and then all of a sudden the good in question gets more expensive. And because it simply got more expensive and my income didn't go up, I feel poorer. My real purchasing power has gone down, and so that has the effect of a drop in income. Now, most often with goods that have a small share of your total spending, this is going to be a really negligible effect. Now, if you're buying all kinds of things and the price of gum goes up by 20% because you buy a couple packs of gum per month, that's going to not make you feel that much poorer because you're spending very little of your money on gum. But for goods that are a large share, like maybe a car payment or a housing, like if cars suddenly became twice as expensive, most people would feel quite a bit poorer because they would be able to not spend as much money on stuff. They'd have less goods that they could buy. And so that loss of purchasing power is essentially lower income. And then because we know sensitivity of demand, we can analyze what happens if income goes down. But this will depend on what kind of good it is, unlike the substitution effect. So remember what a normal good is. A normal good means I want less of it. I want more of it the more money I make. I want less of it the less money I make. So if it's a normal good, this income effect idea, it means that it's going to drop my demand for the good because price went up. I feel poorer. Because I feel poorer, I'm going to demand less of a normal good. And you can see that actually goes in the same direction as substitution effect. So most often, most goods are normal, so most often those are just going to reinforce each other, and it's just they both cause the demand curve to slope that way. But you could have the situation where you have an inferior good, which means as I get poorer, I want to buy more of it. And so the income effect could actually go either direction. So if a price of a good goes up, I feel poorer, so my income effectively has gone down. But now because I feel poorer, I'm going to demand more of that good. And so it goes in the opposite direction of the substitution effect. But almost always the substitution effect dominates, right? That's what wins because the demand curves, as we know, slope down. So if substitution effect is pushing it down, this income effect might push it back up a little bit, but it's still net going to be down. And the situation where income effect makes it go up and it's bigger than that is that very rare situation of what's called a Giffen good, and that actually violates the law of demand. That means the price would the quantity demanded would increase as price increases, and that means that the income effect is so big it's outweighing the substitution effect. So hopefully that gives you a good idea what each of those with the substitution and income effects are. And then just to wrap up here, I wanted to just briefly touch on, we know what price elasticity of demand is. It's how sensitive demand is to changes in prices. Elastic goods are very sensitive to price changes, and inelastic goods are not very sensitive to price changes. So what kind of things drive elasticity of demand? Well, there's 4 factors given in the book, and let's just talk about those. The first is the availability of close substitutes. So like the typical example here might be different proteins. There's beef, chicken, pork. And if you feel those are all close substitutes, that's going to create a much more elastic situation. If the price of your beef changes because you can easily switch away to pork or chicken, it's going to have a much higher sensitivity. So if there's a lot of substitutes, it's more elastic. The next one is necessity versus luxury. Clearly, Goods you have to buy, are going to be less sensitive. This one's almost like common sense. Gasoline is a necessity, so you're not too sensitive to price changes. Uh, top of the line iPhones, brand name designer clothes. If the price goes up quite a bit, you're much likely to be more sensitive to and buy less of it. Next, so yeah, luxury is more elastic. Next one is the share of income spent on a good. If you're spending just a small amount of money on on the good of your income, that means it's going to be more elastic. If you're just buying gum, you might it's easy to substitute away. And then this last factor is time. So if given enough time, people always adapt to price changes. So in the short term, for example, I think I gave this example in class, if gasoline goes up to $20 a gallon, in the very short term, everyone's still going to figure out they're going to drive, and there might be a little bit of change, but people are basically still going to buy gasoline. But over 2 to 3 years, if gasoline stayed that expensive, people would find ways to adapt. They'd just suck it up and start taking public transportation. They'd start buying electric cars. There'd be more development of solar-powered cars, that kind of thing. So time, in the long run, everything is elastic. So that might be the way to think of that one. And that's it. So hopefully this gives you a quick review of the things I wanted to cover.